And why I'm jumping in with a few stories early here, it wasn't in our outline to go with stories, is because I think the stories will help you understand how deeply this is in the primitive body mind. It's not just a thought process, but it's deep in the experiential that happens during infancy and early attachment. I'll share just a little bit. This infant I helped, the infant was 8 months old and it was very precocious and what, loving family, but it would never settle into the mother. We worked in a warm pool and moved the baby through the warm water, and the new mom and dad were there. And it was in moving the baby through the water, and I would say, "Oh, your new mom's voice sounds different. Your new mom and dad smell different." And you could see the infant all of a sudden get activated and sort of go into a little panic. And then we swirled the baby through the water and then put her in her mom and dad's arms. And she just settled. And it was almost like she needed to go through that vortex of the birth canal or something, you never know. But it was by having the story named and having her get some visceral movement and then safety that she could actually settle.
Yeah, and it's really interesting the impact that that early pre-verbal experiences can have on an individual as they grow up and develop. Like I had a very stable, loving, supportive family growing up, and yet I still struggled with mental health issues my entire life. And after my mom died and a bunch of grief came up from that, I was able to start looking at adoption through the lens of grief and started to understand how sad it was to have gone through what I did at such a young age, to go through a loss of a birth culture and a birth family, and to have that confusing time period of being in foster care and being in the hospital without a caregiver when I was like the most helpless I'd ever been in my life. It had a huge impact on me growing up, despite what was a very good adoption story. And so that's kind of what we want to highlight here today is the complicated nature of adoption. Like no matter how much love you can bring a child, you like the parent, has the baby from the moment the story begins of I was adopted, but there's a whole story before the adoption. Even though it seems like such a small amount of time, it still has a hugely significant or can have a hugely significant impact on the development of a child growing up with its attachment systems and with its perception of abandonment and of self-worth and self-esteem and things like that.
And that's because 0 to 18 months, and we know part of my background is I'm a prenatal psychologist, and pre and perinatal focuses on early attachment, the time in the womb, the time post birth. And it's not that we want to make that specialized. Again, I'll highlight that. It's just that we want to give that a context so it gets oriented as a moment in time, not something that can cause the nervous system to get reactive. Because 0 to 18 months is the time frame in infancy where everything's all there is. They don't know that, oh, I'm crying in the crib, but my mom will come in an hour and pick me up. They just think it's forever. Or they think, oh, I'm never, it's all or nothing. And when the body gets the all or nothing signals, it goes into defense structures. It goes into coping mechanisms that don't fit present time. And that's what I help adults with, whether it's adoption or other things, it doesn't matter. It's like, how do you actually regulate your own nervous system so you can stay relational, you can enjoy life, you can learn how to thrive, and you can integrate the hardships of life, but they don't hijack your clarity of thought, your heart, your ability to feel loved and lovable. And these are the things we're speaking to. Do you want to say a little bit, Kristen, about some of the beliefs that you struggled with, or that would come up in terms of regular social interaction?
Sure. I definitely believe that adoption can affect identity formation and values of self-worth. And that adoptees often hold beliefs that result from that pre-verbal trauma that we've been talking about, and the abandonment, such as I'm not lovable, people will leave, it isn't safe to trust, I need to be perfect, I will be whatever you need me to be, I don't belong, something is wrong with me, I'm going to get in trouble. And
So what is it like to be whatever you want me to be?
it means you have less willpower. It's more like your life is out of your own like your life is out of your own control.
Mm-hmm. And then you would be adapting a lot rather than being able to sort of set your ground sometimes, or
Mhm.
push back a little, or have your own space.
Right. Like there's no center. There's no center to yourself. There's only like the fear of abandonment shaping like, well, if I comply, then maybe nothing bad's going to happen. But if I don't, then something bad will happen. So I better just go along with what everybody else is doing.
Does that make sense to our audience? Yeah, little thumbs up if you're following along. Yeah, yeah, and that's the underbelly, and that's what we want to give you a sense of. How do you rest your cheek against the underbelly and help it reorganize?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that happens is we call it need shock. And shock is a term that just means if the body gets overwhelmed, it will go into a freeze response. So that's like having your central spine a little frozen and you move around it. And so that means all the wires aren't quite working. You know, you're not relaxing enough to receive. There can be a hypervigilance. Do you want to say anything about that, Kristen?
I don't know what exactly to say about that, but I do have another quote from somebody. So Leslie Johnson says, children are egocentric by nature, so they believe everything happens because of them. While they may have a conscious understanding of the reasons why they were placed for adoption, some still believe there was something wrong with them, that their mother couldn't parent them. And that's such an early belief, like what Annie was talking about with need shock and everything, like these early beliefs form in a pre-verbal way that end up becoming beliefs such as the ones that I was mentioning of like I'm not lovable or it isn't safe to trust and things like that.
And that's the intelligence of the nervous system. It really astounded me when I realized infants make up identity belief. And I really learned that working with the 4-year-olds in my clinic. And one girl came in with a card. She had been born premature and was so having meltdowns at school. And so her parents brought her in, and their loving family provide lots of value. And she brought a little card on every page was a picture of herself in the incubator with tears, a little stick drawing of a baby. And then on every card, at every page, it said, bad baby. Next page, bad, bad baby. Next page, I am such a bad girl. Now I thought, like, how could that be? You know, how could that be seated in this little nervous system already? And yet, when you think about the neurology, when something's overwhelming, if we go back to almost like our animal instinct, chaos will really create stress. The brain hates chaos, so it likes to organize it. And so forming an identity belief is an attempt to organize chaos. And it usually results in something called self-attack thinking. So what happens is the attack side of that kind of thinking is the fight response. And it's better to fight than go belly up. At least the nervous system thinks it's going to function. and protect. And then attacking the self gives a locus of control in an out of control situation. So then it's like, oh, at least I exist. Even though I'm attacking myself, at least I exist. And that's what is so confusing about the whole situation. And so how, you can work with regular life events and behaviors, which is important. But if you don't also get to the underbelly of where is the matrix of identity formed, and that's why, Kristen, I'm so appreciative of you being here, because I wasn't adopted. I don't have that matrix. I was born premature, so I had some of my own matrix of, how come I'm in a box and where's my family? But I didn't have the big loss forever of my birth mama or forever of my culture at such a young age. And that's the confusion that I think creates a kind of loss.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And something that can compound that is the role of adoption on family dynamics, especially if it's a transracial adoption. Um, there's a conversations about transracial adoption automatically should become conversations about race, but oftentimes parents can grow up with a belief of, well, we don't see color, which can translate into we don't see you. It can create confusion, like further confusion and identity formation for a young transracial adoptee of like, well, I don't look like my family, but they don't see that I don't look like them. So am I invisible, and things like that. So it's always important to address the role of race in adoption. And I actually had this conversation yesterday with a group of Korean adoptees about, what would they have wanted their family to have done differently. And of course, we kind of were like, oh, can be so negative. Like our family loved us and like we're very grateful for our family. But a lot of people did grow up in this era where there was colorblind parenting, where they just weren't given the opportunity to explore their ethnicity as like a Korean American or as a Nigerian American or something like that. And I think that that's an important aspect of adoption too, that's sometimes overlooked, is how do you give those opportunities to your children to explore their own identity, especially because a lot of us growing up didn't want anything to do with our Korean heritage because we just wanted to fit in, even though we didn't feel like we fit in because we were usually the only transracial person in a white community.
Isn't
So
that
it's complicated.
confusing? Imagine being a parent. My kid doesn't want to feel different, so I better not talk about it, right? It's so confusing. So for all the parents who adopt, I just want to, give a shout out of appreciation and gratitude, because often there's no way to know how complex this is. And the more you can understand the support of that, the better it is. And what we're not talking about, in a way, is how does one make meaning of their life and come to peace with their situation? So not to become specialized because you're from a different culture, because you live here. So how do you accept living here, right? How do you grieve that transition? But that transition was so long ago. So you have to grieve it from the infant space, not from the specializing it like it's something to cling to. And that's the dilemma, because part of with adoption is there was no grief ritual for saying goodbye, where the goodbye could actually be felt and accomplished and grieved, and then there's a new hello. Often the goodbyes were sudden. Babies were just dropped off outside the nursery door. There was all kinds of no understanding, and the infant brain cannot understand that kind of a goodbye. So some of the biggest work I do with people who have been adopted, who are, rational and cognitive, not the little infants. The infants, we do it through the body. But when we're working with the ability to think and reason as well, then we have to go back and say goodbye. And sometimes there's a fear of letting go of that adoption identity. And I don't mean that it shouldn't be addressed, but if it's specialized, sometimes what happens is that interferes with the ability to let go and to accept the new life and all the challenges that it presented and all the benefits. And I remember working with one teen, and she really did not want to face that transition, not consciously, but once we got to the deep belly of what was going on, she was it was the last contact she had with her birth mother. The only contact was this story. And if she let go the story, she'd really have to find her own ground. And then what is very helpful in the healing is to talk about the soul and how your soul traveled this journey. And what a miracle that you actually found your adoptive parents and you made it all the way from a different culture to here. And so we're looking with how the adoption gets framed is really key, and being fluid enough to work with a child's needs at the level that they're expressing. And what you're saying, Kristen, so important is not to under name the different culture, but then not to overname it so the kid feels like, well, I'm different, always different, but how to bring understanding. And then if you add that to, you've got perhaps a sensory challenged child, because there's a lot of sensory overwhelm auditorily when the cultural sound is different. There's a lot of sensory pieces that need a little time. And I've worked with so many adopted, I know the stories that, like one teen I'm working with, that there were a bunch of families that went to the orphanage and they all came home on this plane of 18 hours with all the babies screaming. Now that is sensory overload, and that's a transition of time. And then sometimes those babies scream for a whole year.
That's like one of my favorite illustrations of like the image of all these babies on a plane or all these babies in an orphanage, and they're all crying to have their needs met, but there aren't enough people to help them. And so slowly they learn that their crying doesn't mean anything, so they stop crying. And it's actually, I've noticed a pattern among my adoptee friends and adoptee community that a lot of their parents said that they were very quiet babies, that they didn't cry very much. And I always thought that, oh, like we must have just been such well-behaved babies. But I think it was that we had learned early on that crying didn't necessarily mean that any help was going to come. So it was completely pointless to cry.
You're saying that just right. It can be the undercriers and the overcriers. And the undercriers have already gone into the disappointment. With the babies, when they get a chance that maybe somebody's listening, they can't articulate their story. They're just crying because where's my birth mom? What's happening to me? I don't know what to do. And then the ones who have been in the orphanage, sometimes they, like one girl I worked with, they would put all the babies in little car seats and run a big wood pole into the back of the car seats and rock them all at once. And so if you think of movement, the babies are all facing the same direction, right? That's their movement stimulation when they should be down on the tummy crawling around. But it's a lot easier to keep the babies just right there. And this one little girl, she just smacked the kid next to her, right? Because she needed a little stimulation. It wasn't like she was a bad kid, but that's how she got a little stimulation. And so these stories of early is what we want to massage. And the biggest work, and Kristen, that's what's so beautiful about you organizing this panel and doing the understanding work, is each individual has to go back and pick up their adopted infant. They have to pick up themselves. And that's hard,
May I make a
especially,
comment?
yeah, sure. I don't know who it is, but
Uh,
sure.
okay, my name's Jane, and I adopted a Chinese child, and um, after I know the Korean adoptions were a little earlier than the Chinese, but the Chinese adoptions did realize that dealing with the culture was a huge issue, and so when we adopted, there was a group of us that adopted Chinese children. They did encourage us to talk to our children about their Chinese heritage. And unlike a lot of the Korean adoptions, they told us to, we celebrated Chinese New Year in our family, and we um, tried we talked to our daughter about her Chinese heritage and celebrated her Chinese background, and um, uh, talk to her about her history, and try to make her proud of that background and that heritage. And the agency that we use was run by a Chinese couple, and they said, to include that, to talk to her about that, and be proud of that, and tell her where she was from. And uh, we took her to a Chinese school for a little bit. She didn't learn much
So
Mandarin.
that's what you're saying, and it's different
Yeah.
from different cultures. And thank goodness, because then it's not just a gap, right?
Right.
It's a bridge. And that's what the parents are trying to do, is build the bridge. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about, do you want to read the statistics, Kristen, that you have?
Sure.
Okay, and then we'll come back to a little more of like, how do you work with this?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, thank you, Jane, for sharing. Um, so one statistic is that adoptees are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than non-adoptees, which is a very high statistic when you look at the fact that war veterans are 1.5 times more likely to commit suicide than people who never served in the army. So adoptees are 4 times more likely. It's a very high statistic. It's alarming. And that despite comprising only 2% of the population, adoptees make up about 30 to 35% of patients at inpatient care facilities and mental health facilities. So the mental health impacts are large, and I think a big reason is because adoption has, not always, but usually has been kind of looked at as just a blanket, very simple, good thing to happen to a child, which it is a good thing, but it's also a very complicated thing. And the complicated aspect gets looked over and can create problems for young adoptees.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I had friends who adopted a child before he was born, and this child had a wonderful life. And then he's in his late 20s in his first long-term relationship, and unfortunately with someone who had a borderline personality disorder, apparently, and he commits suicide. He wanted to leave the relationship and he couldn't get out, and that was his act. And the parents were floored, devastated. And you can imagine the abandonment fear this young man had of trying to leave his, partner, and then the confusion of someone with a personality disorder on top of that. And so these are things we have to find supportive solution in terms of mental health. And I think getting to the underbelly stories and helping parents know how to dance the waves of the integration of who am I? Who am I? Where did I come from? Do I have a right to be here? What am I still mad about? And often, without knowing it, an adopted child will need to be the focus of attention all the time. And this can really exhaust a family. And part of it is because some of it, if you think of early primitive brain configuration, sometimes that adopted baby in utero was so focused on either both not connected with because the mother knew she was going to give the baby away, or the mother was completely worried and nervous and afraid, and here her body is growing into all the hormones of love and connection, but she can't. And so sometimes feeling invisible is often another component of adoption. And so then the children can focus on the adoptive mom who gets the projection of the birth mom. So sometimes the adoptive mom is the kid is angry at the mom, and then the little child will side with the dad, and it kind of splits the family, like the good parent, the bad parent. Dad is safe, but mom is not. And so, I just want to name that sometimes mothers who are doing their best really have to learn how to have a little bit of tough love and not be afraid of hurting their child, but have the proper ways to set a limit so they're not the target of the child's unconscious attack. It's like, I always think of it that our body has an unfinished story. What's the story trying to be told? What's the story inside of difficult behavior? If someone is mad at their birth mom for giving them away, we better tell that story. And with the children, you do it with the stuffed animals, and you really externalize it and act it out so that the child knows, or you have a little goodbye ritual with the stuffed animals, and you bring in the birth dad because he's never mentioned. There's often a big focus on the birth mom, but what about the birth dad? And so I like to externalize this early story with the children, especially, but it also works with adults, is you show the child view, and you externalize the story, and you show that everybody, you survived. And you show the complexity, like you put the little stuffed animals in the airplane, and you bring them to your new culture. And then you show how confusing it is, and how, so you're kind of externalizing so that someone can integrate what was precognitive. And so those kinds of things, like here I see in our outline, Kristen, a few of your stories. Did you want to share any of those
Sure.
points?
Well, mine's kind of the opposite of being the center of attention. But I remember when I was in fourth grade, I was at a friend's house. My parents were having a party, and I was at my friend's house after being at our party for a little while, and I broke my arm. I was playing and somebody tripped and fell on top of me, and I didn't want to be a burden, so I didn't tell anybody. And I just sat on the porch and waited for my mom to pick me up at the time she was going to pick me up. And even then, I didn't want to tell my mom because I didn't want to upset the day, and I didn't want to be a burden or cause trouble or make anybody go out of their way for me. And it took a few hours. I think we went to the hospital close to midnight. I don't know, my dad's on this call, I don't know if he remembers that, but I just remember sitting on my friend's porch not telling anybody why I wasn't playing the game anymore, because I just didn't want to change the course of the day.
And so let's pause there for a moment, and everybody kind of take a breath. Sometimes it's hard to think about this stress, but let's look at what would be the belief in a little child. Why wouldn't they say, oh, my arm hurts? Oh, no, it's like, oh, if I'm not perfect, maybe I'll be given away. That's a common belief. If I make waves, I might be given away, because they have a knowledge that few people have. Direct experiential knowledge of that event. And it's so precognitive. And that's why it can be confusing to parents, because they have no intent of giving their child away. They worked hard to get that baby, right? And yet that belief can still live there. And so that's why it's so useful. And if any of you on the call have been adopted, I would just really encourage you to start mining the deep beliefs or the shock and bring some spaciousness into it, and start to, like, maybe even with stuffed animals, play out your adopted story and externalize it, and then notice what emotions come up. Notice where your reactions are. Who are you mad at? What are you afraid of? Because everyone has their own internal, complex, whether you're adopted or not adopted. And we all have to learn how to grow up and thrive and come to terms with our life. And by being able to do that, it builds a little more of a solid self.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's just never, because I never really thought about what my life was like before being adopted. My life story always began with, well, I was adopted when I was 4 months old. And it was through working with Annie that we really slowed down. I remember she was like, well, what happened before you were adopted? And I was like, well, I was just adopted. And then she's like, no, slow the story down. What happened? And as we slowly went through like the moments of my life before being adopted, it became very emotional for me to kind of go through and realize the extent of what I had experienced at such a young age. And so I just think it's important for adoptees to be like looking at what is the role of the adoption, what is the role of the separation before I was adopted, what is the role of the time before I was adopted. But I also, Annie, I don't know if we should go into the last part because I think have about a little less than 20 minutes left and we want to leave time for Q&A.
Yeah, why don't I guide the little, do you think we should do the little guided thing first and then the Q&A? What's your sense, honey?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so I'm gonna invite you. You don't have to participate in this, but you're welcome to. I'm gonna invite you in a little guided exploration as if you were adopted. And I just want to sort of guide you through that for about 5 minutes, and then we'll stop and we'll sort of harvest what emerged for you. Because when you can understand someone from the inside out, it's more helpful. So is that all right with people? A little guided visualization thing? Yeah? Okay. So you can close your eyes and take a breath. Oh, and it's okay to keep your eyes open and watch if you prefer. Either way is fine. And just imagine, here you are. You kind of can tell you have a body. You feel the weight of yourself in your chair. And when you try to orient, that's what helps us feel safety. It's a very deep biological principle, the ability to orient. And imagine here you are, and you all of a sudden you realize, gosh, I don't know where I came from. I know I exist, but I have no idea where I came from. And just notice what that feels like. No idea. Whoa, where did I come from? And then feel this sort of instinct, whether it's in your head, your heart, your gut. Who's my mother? Like, who are you? Or, wow, I have no idea about my father. I don't know whether they're alive or dead. I don't know if they exist. I mean, they have to exist or they had to, but that doesn't help me know who I am. And now feel I don't know I don't know where I came from. I don't know who is my mother, who is my father. And now feel the confusion. Am I a bad person? Was I given away because I am flawed? There must be some reason that happened. So maybe, and what's so confusing is I don't feel like a bad person, but somehow that happened. And so then this sort of uncertainty, and how the uncertainty can create a kind of mistrust. Like I don't know whether I even can, because I don't have anything. I don't know anything. Maybe I'm not. Maybe what I feel is inaccurate. I don't know. And so this unending confusion or identity or something's wrong with me. Now, take all of that and sort of wrap it in a little bubble. What we're going to do is we're going to kind of give that up to God. When we have these deep complexities we can't figure out. So I don't want you to carry any residual trauma participating in this guided thing. So I want you to take all of that and help it deepen the understanding in your heart and in your mind and in your gut. And then I want you to sort of send that up as a prayer. And maybe, we pray for the benefit of all who have confusion about their place with God, their place in the world. And we send a special prayer out to the parents who have adopted, the mamas who have had to give their children away or made a choice because they knew that their child would grow up in a better world. And we send a prayer out to all the children and the adults who have gone through that journey, that may they have peace of mind, peace of heart, develop a trust in themselves so they don't have to carry the fight. They can actually find the nourishment, the relaxation, and the heartfelt presence. And then let's finish our prayer and let that go and have a big breath. Oh, and then just rub your hands for a minute, brush up and over the top of your head. Stretch a little, look around your room so you're not staring at the screen. Yeah, blink your eyes. Ah, yeah. And let's just take a little time to, you can unmute yourselves and we'll just sort of popcorn and see who want, maybe just wave your hand so people know you want to talk, and that will help us not talk over each other. And we'll just have a little share what that brought up for you. And then actually, because of time, Chris, would it be good to make a little short breakout room where you just, do you know how to do that? How about a 3-minute breakout room of 2 people?
Okay.
So people have just a moment to share what came up for them. That will make them more accessible for the rest of the lecture. It's just a chance to share what came up for you with your neighbor, and then we'll all come back together. Yeah, people are arriving back. Welcome back. Welcome back, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Thumbs up?
Yes.
Yeah, here. Okay, good. I hope that was gave you a chance to just integrate some of that experience. My wish is that you understand how confusing it is, and that the ability to orient is a primal instinct and need. And so if you can help someone orient to who they are in time and space, in place. Chris was saying how did Kristen find you? And I was sharing that I had worked with some adopted children, and Kristen, you were nannying for them. And so it was this circuitous leap of faith in a way. And that's kind of where grace of God is such an important part also in this healing. And so I want to just say that I will be presenting an online course on adoption specifically in the fall. It's taken me about 3 years to gather what can I share, and it'll be for therapists or families, but I'll let the church know about that when the time is ready. I just wanted to, if there's anything anyone wants to ask or say, we have time for just a few little bits. And I think we're going to let some new people speak. Yeah, who haven't spoken yet. Go ahead. Lua.
Hey, you mentioned that there was a person who was dating someone with borderline personality disorder and then they unfortunately killed themselves.
Yeah, that was tragic.
Yeah. Were you saying that like because they were dating someone who had borderline personality disorder, that was a part of why they killed themselves?
I'm saying that is a very unusual circumstance, and that attachment is so key with adoption, feeling safe enough and to attach. And so when this young man started to say, I'm ready to leave you, the escalation in intensity and craziness made it really hard.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, with that personality disorder, it's very hard to leave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just wondered about it because I don't know if I have it. I've like looked it up and I have symptoms of it, but yeah, I've read that it is hard to like leave and stuff when you're had that
Yeah.
particular
And you
one.
might, there's a wonderful book called Understanding the Borderline Mother. It's in the Boulder Public Library. It was just instrumental to see a little bit more about that. And sometimes you're not that personality, but you may have been raised by somebody who was.
Mhm.
And so those could be some resources. Other question? Yeah.
Susan,
Nancy?
Susan raised her hand too.
Oh,
as
go
well.
ahead. Or Susan?
Susan and then Nancy.
Yeah, I wondered how drug and alcohol use by mother affects the nervous system.
It does.
But how does that happen? What is it that happens?
Well, I worked with one little boy who was adopted. His mom was highly into drugs and was actually in prison when she gave birth. And so I worked with this little boy and he could not relax. He was so motoring. And I said, you're going to have to raise this kid to be a weightlifter. You're going to have to give him things to do because his system has this energy. And sometimes you can help it with cranial sacral, where you put your hands on the brain and you try to tease out the nervous system, or you can help with sensory challenges, but it's a deep signature.
Thank you.
And who was next?
Nancy.
So I was adopted at 6 months, and that was in the early 50s. They really held on to babies during those times, and I'm not sure why. But when my parents brought me home at 6 months, I could not hold my head up, and I was considered a failure to thrive baby. And that just makes me angry. I don't understand a system that would hold on to babies that long. I was told I had health issues, but I thought, well, those can be dealt with later. It just,
Right.
I don't understand that. And I wonder if you've dealt with any patients in that similar situation.
Yeah, it's very confusing. So the adoption's finalized, but they won't let the baby go. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm just saying, I don't know how it unfolded, but I was in foster care until I was 6 months old.
Yeah, I work
No
with
serious
children who are in
problems,
foster care from all kinds of ages, including 5-year-olds and 8-year-olds. And it is what it is. It's not good. Thank goodness there was some care. And how does one integrate that experience? Because if you're still a little mad about it,
I'm a lot mad about it.
well, if you're a lot mad about it, that energy can become personal power once you let go of what it's attached to. And, the inability to lift the head shows that probably developmentally you weren't allowed to crawl.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why if a baby can't, that's why it's really important babies are on their tummies. They push down and that helps them learn to lift their head. But if the babies are on their backs or they don't get to crawl, they are weaker in structure. And you have to go back and repattern that. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
So we are at the end of our time here, and I want to be mindful of that. And I also want to say, Kristen, I'm so grateful to you for bringing this to our attention. Oh my goodness, I don't think, I feel like I've learned so many new things just in the last hour. So thank you for bringing your story to us, and thank you I give thanks to God that you found Annie. And I know your dad, Larry, is here on the phone. I'm glad you're here with us, Larry. And for all of you who are adoptees and adoptive parents and grandparents into our mental health ministry, this feels like a really, just a really important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure. And Kristen, thank you, of course.
Thank you, Annie, and thank you, Chris, for your kind words. I'm glad we got this together finally.
Me too. Thanks for your patience. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
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 So I guess we'll say bye now. If you want to reach me further, I think it's in the bulletin, but it's been a blessing to share this with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.